How about that?
Yeah.
Okay. Again, thanks. I'm Aaron Stauffer, the Secretary of Alum. We're happy to have you all here for another iteration of our conversation series. We've been exploring these conversations with contributors to the Theological Education Between the Times series. Today, we're welcoming Reverend Dr. Dan Aleshire. I'm going to give a brief introduction, hand it over to Dr. Helen Blyer, our president, to say a word. And then, Dan, if you want to take the floor, it's yours after that. Dr. Ayrshire will give us a little bit of a review of his book and a conversation at the horizons of theological education. He has some slides to share with us. This presentation will be brief. It'll be 10 to 15 minutes, and then we'll jump in. We have had some questions submitted in advance, so this is going to be a really good time together. Thank you all for being here. Helen, do you want to say a welcome?
Yes, absolutely. Welcome, everybody. It's so good to see so many familiar faces around the screen and to see some new ones as well. I'm Helen Blyer. I have the privilege of working with a mighty fine group of people as the president of the Association of Leaders in Lifelong Learning for Ministry, ALM. And we've got a number of our exec team members. Those of you who are exec team members, just wave at the screen so folks have a visual, know who you are. Good to see you here. We are an organization that provides a community of practice for people who do the work that we do, this broad field called leadership and lifelong learning. And we've been convening these conversations just to get our brains working, speak with some of the leaders in the field, help us understand where the work that we do intersects with where the industry of theological education is going. And it's a particular delight for me to be part of the welcome team for Dan Aleshire today, since I had the great privilege of working with Dan for a number of years. We're not going to say how many years ago that was, Dan. Neither of us have aged since then, I'm sure. I will hand it over to Dan. Please note that we've got a newsletter coming up for those of you who are members with all sorts of good stuff coming up. We had a great strategic planning session. You'll hear all about that. And stay tuned for more great stuff coming up from Alum to support you in the work that you're doing. So with that, back over to you, Aaron, to kickstart the conversation. In the meantime, I'd like all of you guys to grease the wheels of the chat box down at the bottom of your screen. Put who you are and what institution you're coming from. And if you're from an interesting geographic place, Glenn, I see you. Please put that in there as well.
Thank you, Helen. Daniel Aleshire retired in 2017 as the executive director of the Association of Theological Schools. After serving that organization since 1990, Aleshire holds a BS from Belmont University and an MDiv from the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, an MA and a PhD in psychology from George Peabody's College for Teachers in Nashville. An ordained minister, he has written extensively on issues of ministry and education. That bio is very abbreviated. We are really overjoyed to have Dr. Aleshire with us today. Dan, please take it away.
Thanks, Aaron, and thank all of you for joining in this conversation and for the work that you do trying to provide a public character to the otherwise private work that goes on in much of your institutions. You've been looking at some of the books that were generated as part of the theological education between the times. I won't go into those. You can look up that series, but this is one of that series in which the title is one of my contribution is Beyond Profession. I want to talk just a little bit about what's in the book, if and a little bit around what's not in the book, but what underlies the book. Basically, I spent some time looking at the history of theological education from the colonies to the present. It's a history that expands in multiple directions. It's primarily a Protestant history in the 18th and 19th centuries. It becomes more Roman Catholic history in the 19th century, but operating as a completely separate entity from the Protestant patterns of theological education. We get to the 20th century. What had been relatively unified Protestant image really breaks into two broad Protestant communities, evangelical Protestant and mainline Protestant. Those two communities went about theological education in some ways similar to one another, but in other ways quite different from one another. And the theological battles that resulted in the broad scope of evangelical Protestant and mainline Protestant are evident in how those two groups are doing their theological education. I think I wondered about doing some slides, but I'm thinking about maybe just talking, if you don't mind not looking at PowerPoint slides. Some of you may not know how to think without PowerPoint slides, so this might be a opportunity to imagine what the world was like. My friend of 40 years, recently of memory, Barbara Wheeler, would say that PowerPoint can corrupt absolutely at times. And I have quoted her many times over these years, but not so much since her passing last fall. Theological education kind of began in the United States before it was the United States. Harvard and Yale and William and Mary and Columbia and the College of New Jersey, which was to become Princeton University, all had as a primary institutional reason for their coming into being the education of clergy. The education of clergy was not like we do it now. It was an assumption that these institutions were educating people for the public good. That would be either in the role of religion in the culture, or it would be in civic enterprises. So you became a leader in the community, the government. You became a leader in religion, and there was a common kind of curriculum for both. The result was that theological education was not as articulated as it came to be. And it was more an education in a general pattern of Protestant piety. That begins to change in the 19th century as the nation is moving forward. And what happens in the 19th century in Protestant theological education is that it begins to specialize. So those institutions start developing entities within them, like a divinity school that would take care of the clergy education, while the rest of the university moved in different directions. It was also the era when the freestanding theological school began in the 19th century. There were none really before the 19th century, except the Roman Catholic schools that and as you have freestanding schools by the second half of the 19th century, you have the development of disciplines. That earlier age of theological education was sort of education in divinity. But it's not till after about 1850 that you start seeing the development of disciplines in higher education in general, like the American Historical Society, that sort of thing. And you get these disciplines sort of developing in the latter part of the 19th century. They take hold in the early 20th century. And by mid-century, we have separate theological education that's highly disciplinary in its structure. The early disciplines of Bible and history and theology expand into disciplines that include ethics, that include um, the growing number of disciplines in the study of ministry. None of those disciplines really existed before the 20th century, but you see the emergence of study in religious education, church administration, pastoral care and counseling, sociology of religion. All of that is a 20th century invention in theological education. So the curriculum just kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, or to cover all of the territory. The amount of each territory was limited in certain ways. Most of us, at least I'll talk for myself, the curriculum that I came through was sort of divided by thirds into Bible and history and philosophy and theology, where 2/3 and the other third was ministry studies. What emerges in the second half of the 20th century is a solid understanding of professional theological education, like legal education or social work education or medical education. The education of clergy was educating a community of professionals who were going to function as religious professionals in churches, in the parachurch and other related agencies and entities. Through all of this time, there were three kind of forces moving in theological education that were from outside of it. One was the culture, and you see that dramatically in those early theological education structures and institutions. Religion was helping to form American culture, and American culture was forming American religion. The other was higher education practices. The disciplinary structure in theological education followed the development of disciplinary structures in higher education in general. And it was the practice of religion. And how religion is practiced, how higher education is practiced, how the culture holds religion or education in its own purview influence how theological schools do their work. The reason I went into the history in Beyond Profession is because I'm not a historian, but I've read a lot of history of theological education, and it always exists in compartments. I was trying to sort of briefly say, here's what it looks like in Protestant, in evangelical Protestant, in Roman Catholic, because you can't talk about one theological education. It really functions differently in these broad religious communities in the United States and Canada, as well as it functions, it continuing to emerge. In the 19th century, we have the formation of theological education related to the historic Black church. In the 21st century, these first 25 years, ATS has 11 or 12 schools now, about the same number as historically Black theological schools, whose primary language of instruction is Cantonese or Mandarin or Korean. These Asian language theological schools. So it continues to develop a little differently, but what I tried to argue is that these three forces, you can look at these groups of religious presence in the United States and Canada. You can look at these periods of time, and the common thread that's running through them is the influence of culture, the influence of higher education, and the influence of the church and religious practices. We can do that with Roman Catholics. We can do that with evangelicals. We can do that with mainline Protestants. We can do that with the emerging racial ethnic composition of current and developing theological education. So the point is that theological education isn't its own thing. It's always being influenced by these other factors. It's not just inventing itself because it thinks this is what good theological education is going to be. It's emerging in these other forces of culture, higher education, and religious practice. So then we have to come to the present moment. And we are in a culturally squirrely time in the United States and elsewhere, not just politically, but in a whole lot of ways about how religion is understood. On the one hand, we have a secularizing culture in general, and on the other hand, we have increasing political presence of particular more conservative religious expressions. In this culture, if religion isn't being battered one way, it's trying to batter the culture. The culture has seemed to walked away from part of its common narrative of what it means to be a citizen of this country, um, of what citizenship means, of how we understand our relationships in community, and as we become more individualized and more secular and more interior, and we become, as a recent, Atlantic article had it, an individualized rather than community being important. We live as individuals in front of our screens, etc. Well, that's going to influence theological education. If culture is a squirrely time, we have to notice that religion is in a fundamental shift culturally and in its practices. The number of persons who claim membership in a religious community has declined. And in the last decade, for the first time since anybody had been noting it in this culture, the number of persons who claim to be uh, uh, religiously involved had declined significantly. The number of Protestants became less than half of the population in general. Roman Catholics have remained pretty constant, about 25% of the American population, but they've done it by immigration models. The number of white Catholics has been decreasing. The number's been constant because of the number of immigrant Catholics that have emerged in the country. And religious practices. Many of us may remember or have read about a time when you could go to a Methodist church and most of the churches functioned the same way, or a Baptist church and they tended to function the same way. That's off the screen now. Congregations are more individualized and different. The structure of denominations has decreased significantly. It's not just in the membership, it's in the things those denominations used to do. Some of the work that you are trying to put together through theological schools is work that used to be done by denominations, of educating persons who've come to work in the churches, the congregations, parishes, of supporting lay leadership. And as denominations have weakened, the capacity to do those kind of things has dissipated. The structure of American religion is changing, and as is the structure of higher education. In 2018, the person becoming president of Harvard University in his inaugural address said, I've come from a time when assumptions about higher education were pretty well established, and now it's like none of them are established. And you can only look at what the public's done with Harvard in the last decade of trying to minimize the impact and the value of what was an intellectual, has been since before the nation became a nation, an intellectual leadership in the country. I heard a lecture once several years ago by Robert Zemsky, who was a professor of higher education at the University of Pennsylvania, who said, you can kind of look at the town, you can kind of look at the county seat town, and all of the institutions that had pillars are in trouble. The government system had pillars in front of the courthouse. The church had pillars in front of the sanctuary. Higher education had pillars in front of its main building. And those cultural institutions, all of them are in fundamental change. Well, the point is, if those are the influences on theological education, culture, higher education, religious practices, and they're all in a relatively unique and interesting stew right now, what does that do for us in theological education? Well, just look at your schools or look at some other schools if yours is still operating like it's 1975. And you'll see how these influences are coming on theological education. My point in Beyond Profession, as in the title, was not so much an analysis of the practices of theological education, but what does it mean to do, what are theological educators educating for in this kind of cultural, religious, and higher education moment? And my point was that the culture and the religious practices and the higher education practices that brought us to the professional model of theological education that was post-baccalaureate, that was disciplinary focused, that tended to assume the primary job of theological education was to cultivate knowledge and critical reflection about religious reality, so that with knowledge, specialized knowledge, persons could lead communities of faith. What I think is that professional model is no longer fits. That doesn't mean that the things we were doing in the professional model ought to be continued as part of theological education practices. What it means is that that professional model no longer works. It no longer fits the religious realities or the higher education realities that we're dealing with. What I proposed is a formational model of theological education. Formation is being used a lot. It is such a popular word because it doesn't have much of a definition. Everybody can use formation and mean something that fits their world about them. And when I'm talking about formational theological education, I have a definition of it in mind. And I'm going to read that definition. If I were a really good author, I would have memorized it, but I'm not, and I'm an old white man, and memory is shaky. What I wrote is that the formational theological education involves the development of a wisdom of God and the ways of God that's fashioned from intellectual, affective, and behavioral understanding, and evidenced by spiritual and moral maturity, relational integrity, knowledge of scripture and tradition, and the capacity to exercise religious leadership. You'll notice in that definition some things that theological education has been doing. You'll notice some other things that theological education imagined that some other part of the religious world was doing, like spiritual and moral formation, or like the patterns of learning that come to us affectively. The problem we're dealing with, I think, for seminaries, is that broader religious ecology in the squirrely world of those influences we live in is you can't depend on it anymore. The students coming to seminary haven't been to camp necessarily. They haven't, because there weren't as many camp experiences as might have been. They haven't been through all of the systems and structures that lively denominations and multiple congregations were able to practice. The what I'm arguing basically, and I'll stop here in a few minutes to give us time to talk together, is that in a world that's religiously confused, where the culture is not sure what to do with religion, where religion's the most public presence of religion is a small part of the total expanse of religious expression in the country, that having a professional as a minister won't carry the day. What's going to carry the day is the religious leader who has deep authenticity to faith, who has the ability to relate effectively and warmly and generatively with other human beings, who has the capacity to lead organizations, and who knows the scripture and the tradition, who knows it not only intellectually, but knows it, in Pascal's line, the heart hath its reason that reason doth not know, who is a believer. And that theological education, and what we do in continuing theological education, is an effort to cultivate these things. Now, to one point I would say about the kind of work you're doing. Schools are set up so they are in ways that are very good at intellectual formation. It's hard to go through all of the Bible and theology that the typical MDiv student goes through and not think differently. It is possible to go through all of that and not feel differently or not behave differently. And what I'm kind of arguing for is a pattern of education that is as sophisticated in its affective capacity and behavioral capacity as in its intellectual capacities. The problem is with how we do theological education, whether it's online or in person, it still tends to be intellectually focused. And the one place where we're educated affectively and behaviorally tends to be in the practice of religion and in the practice of ministry, in the context of other people of faith who can love you and who can hate you. I finished all of my education, went to a pastorate as my first place of service. I had been warned about this particularly mean parishioner who liked to give the pastor the hard way to go. My first sermon in that church, he met me at the back of the church before anybody else could get there and said, "Well, that was the worst damn sermon I've ever heard." And with that in my heart, I was ready to greet my new congregation. You learn from a moment like that in a way you don't learn from how you learn liturgy or homiletics, because we tend to come at them because of the structure of classrooms theoretically. But what we want to do with them is as much affective and behavioral, how we want to influence people as ministers in congregations or church-related other entities. And so what I'm arguing is that the organizing core of professional ceases to be adequate. And a new organizing core has to be in terms of how we are faithful, how we hold that faith, how we love that faith, how we behave that faith, how we articulate it intellectually, and how we exercise leadership out of that center of gravity rather than a set of knowledge and skills. doesn't exclude the knowledge of skills. We have a lot of people who don't know nothing, who don't know anything, who are trying to be the religious authority in their community, and it will not ultimately serve our faith communities very well, in my judgment. So that's the nature of this argument, that theological education does not do its own thing. It's always responding to culture, to higher education, to religious practices, and that we've got to look at the current realities. And when we do, we'll see the inadequacy of the old professional model and the need for another model. I'm calling it formational theological education, but I'm not. But I'm using that word with a particular definition, that we have something in mind of what we want people to be if they are formed in ministry. So I'll leave it there, Helen and Aaron, and invite your conversation.
Thank you so much. That was just fascinating, and a wonderful view of where we come from and where we might go. Friends, I'll start off our conversation with a question here to Dan, and then invite you all to either raise your hands physically and I can keep track of you in the chat, or please do it virtually and that'll start a queue for us. I'm sure we've got lots of questions here, in part because Dr. Aleshire, you defined formation. Thank you. That's wonderful. I really appreciate that because it is so often in these conversations when people will say things like leaders or formation and won't exactly define them at all about what they mean. I want to just bring up a quote actually that I preached on in a congregation this past Sunday that comes from Russell Moore. He was doing an interview. It was the previous head of the Southern Baptist Coalition, right? He was interviewed by NPR's Scott Detrow before Christmas. And I'm going to put the quote in the chat, but I won't read it out. I'll just kind of give you the overview. Essentially, and lots of conversations Russell Moore has had with pastors in evangelical congregations, what was related back to Moore was that there was oftentimes moments when the pastors would preach about the Sermon on the Mount or the Sermon on the Plain, and the parishioners would say, "Where did you get those liberal talking points?" And then the pastor would say, "Well, these are the literal words of Christ." And the response would not be from Moore, would not be, or from the parishioners, relating these comments. They wouldn't say, "Oh, I'm sorry, that's right, okay, that's Christ." Instead, it would be, "That doesn't fly anymore. That's weak." And so part of my question is if lifelong learning and theological education is always in response to the culture surrounding it, your definition of formation here provides us a number of different handrails to guide the formation of leaders and the instruction of leaders to build institutions that can meet the day. And yet, what about the politics of it all? What about the fact that so much of popular Christianity now is defined by January 6th? What do we do with white nationalism? What do we do with power? I'm curious on how your conception of formation meets pastors in their current reality, which is the fact that they're often curious about community organizing, that they're curious about how they can partner with civic groups to protect their neighbors. I'm just curious. I know that you have an answer. I don't assume this. I just thought, as you were thinking about this, I thought, oh, I just read this quote from Moore. What might Dan have to say?
I have an opinion. I don't know that I would call it an answer.
Right. And this is, I live in this work often. I'm constantly working with congregations that are coming to me in the questions. So it's not an easy question. I understand that. So Jordy, yes, this is not a sort of gotcha. It's more of just, hey, things are hard. Help me think about how to do this.
I think two or three things, Aaron. Have two or three opinions. One is that we need to remind Christians that the most important part of their life is being Christian. And anytime we let other cultural realities become the most important part of our lives, whether that's politics or money or anything else, we're beginning to walk that narrow line toward idolatry. We're putting something as more important. And we can talk with people about what it means to be a good Christian. We can talk with people about what it means to be a follower of Christ and what he taught. But more than that, we can actually be that, not perfectly, but I think that we've gone through a period of ministers feeling overwhelmed because of the expectation of there being the perfect Christian. We've given ourselves lots of permission to be less than perfect Christians, which is fundamentally a Christian perspective. But we also need to realize that we stand for a particular way of understanding the world, a way of understanding ourselves. And we've got to be authentic in the way we stand for it. I think in a divided world that shows up in divided congregations, we have to begin with the assumption, we have to say it out loud, we are divided over against each other. In most congregations, there's very little that can be said politically that won't be offensive to somebody in the room. And so let's admit that. And let's admit that that the world has crept into the way we think about being Christian, and the emotional separation that exists, the emotionally laden divisions in the culture come into the church. And so, but we still need to take a casserole to someone when their relative dies. We still need to send a card to someone when they've been in the hospital. We still need to feed the cat or dog of the person who has to be away for the to tend to a ill parent or a family death. It's all of the little things that never get written about in the media that kind of weave the fabric community. And we need to be reminded that we are the people who do that kind of stuff all the time. And that we do it even though we disagree with the person we're doing it with. You told us about your Sunday sermon. I'll tell you about the one I listened to. My wife and I are spending a little bit of time in Boston to get acquainted with a new grandson we have here. So we went to my son's church, and then I listened to our church online. And it was the pastor was preaching from a lectionary text about loving the people that are hard to love. And so he had a really fine sermon, but then he said, here's how we're going to close this sermon. I want every one of you in the room to think about somebody who annoys you, who frustrates you, who makes you angry. And I want you to spend the next 2 minutes in prayer about them. And then there's this long silence. I bet most people won't remember hardly a point that he had in his sermon, good as they were. They will remember that they struggled in that time trying to figure out who they were going to pray for and what they were going to pray, and if they could pray for them. All of a sudden, the sermon got affective and not just intellectual. All of a sudden, it was about me and who I don't like or who drives me up the wall, and what do I do as a Christian about that person. I think that we've got to create some space that is alternative to the reality that's on the outside, even though it's on the inside. And, you know, I haven't been in that space. I haven't been a pastor in this era. I don't know what to say to people who are living that reality, except that the only thing I know to hang on to is being Christian and being thoughtful and heartfelt and behaviorally consonant in the way we are Christians, and inviting other people to do that, and then acknowledging our division. One church in Pittsburgh had what made it onto the local NPR station because in the middle of the election, uh, uh, church people began posting purple yard signs. They printed up purple yard signs and posted them just with a simple affirmation of of the country and their faith. And you could be, it didn't make any difference what color other yard sign you may have had in. To have a purple was to say there is some space in our lives that's not just uh, deep red or shiny blue. And I appreciated that pastor's leadership. And the NPR article basically interviewed laypersons in that congregation who had put the purple signs in their for their yard. That had become their yard sign during the election.
Thank you so much. I mean, you gave an incredibly fulsome answer that you did not have to. I really appreciate your integrity and your genuineness in engaging in these conversations. Jody, I see you've got a question.
I just wanted to thank you for the definition, Dan, that you have shared, and then ask a question about it, if I may. The definition of the formational model. I really appreciate it that it's about this holistic approach to formation, and it resonates with, for example, at Acadia Divinity College, when we're thinking about our learning outcomes and we use frameworks like Bloom's taxonomy, for example, to try to think in those different dimensions, or even the medicine wheel in partnership with our Indigenous neighbors. And I like a lot, at least it seems to me, that it opens up our ecology of theological education kind of beyond that graduate degree space into any number of other spaces, and any number of other kinds of things. I think my question is about how you would elaborate the communal aspect of it. It feels to me as I read it that in some ways it's focused on individual formation, which is not unimportant, of course, but how would you elaborate kind of the communal formation of Christian communities as part of the work of theological education going forward?
Well, one of the critiques of this definition is how is it unique for religious leaders? Isn't this what we want all Christians to have? And therefore, it could become a model of thinking about what we want the community of faith to cultivate in individual believers. I think that the answer for pastors and clergy is not just that they have more of these things, but they have a deeper consonant level of integration of them, as well as the capacity to lead in ways lay people, we want them to lead as well. We don't, but different, the organizing of leadership structures, for example, we would see as more clerical clergy task. It is individualistic. It's not meant to be individualistic, but ultimately, when I'm thinking of seminary students, it's one student at a time. When you put your educational goals together, those students need to demonstrate their achievement of those goals. So there is an individual character to the definition. I would celebrate communities claiming this as a communal goal, and the ways, and that might be a better way for congregations to think about it. It's not what we want in our pastor, it's what we want in ourselves, what it means for us to function as a community of faith, and where do we need to grow, and how do we need to build one another up to function in that way. Great question, Jody. Thank you.
Jody. Friends, other questions?
Aaron, this might be a good time to dig into the questions that Daryl Stevens, who could not be with us, shared, because they relate directly to the concerns of Alam.
So I will drop it into the chat and then I'll read it out for us here. So this is a question submitted in advance. Beyond profession doesn't say much about lifelong learning for ministry. What you've written about before in three previous articles, you focused on degree programs and graduate theological schools as the site of theological education. However, you also acknowledge graduate theological schools as part of a broader ecology of theological education, an ecology that includes non-degree programs and continuing education for ministry. What relationship do you see between lifelong learning, non-degree theological education programs, and graduate theological schools? Are they partnerships, embedded programs, stepping stone, ancillary, competitor, inferior, necessary compromise? Yeah.
As you know, if we, particularly among Protestants, if you look at the number of persons who are leading congregations who were alternatively credentialed by their denomination, or who have been, they're local pastors for Methodists, they're licensed pastors for Presbyterians and Lutherans. They are the number of persons who are leading congregations, typically smaller congregations, who don't have a typical theological education experience, is getting proportionate to the number that do, if it does not exceed them. Which means that if we think of the graduate theological education as the only way of the theological education, we're eliminating the opportunity for theological education for many of the people who are serving, if not in coming years, a majority, as congregational size continues to decrease and full-time ministry opportunities are lessened. So what the issue becomes, how do we begin thinking about non-degree theological education? How do we think about theological education? I was talking with a group of Methodists about local pastors, and I was saying, I was sort of saying that I don't think you should ever get out of local pastor school. That is, it should continue for not just be a kind of a completed course that once it's done, you're done and you're doing ministry, but that we're continuing to educate. I wish that we would hold that for MDiv graduates. I think that we're, to the extent that, let me back up a minute. Probably the professional model is what generated the patterns of continuing education that we have. That, like other professionals, you're supposed to get updated. You're supposed to learn some additional things to stay up on your area of professional expertise. So you can't be a CPA without continuing education in CPA-ness. You can't be a social worker without can't keep your license up. And so I think that because the professional model never really took hold as much as I would suggest it did in the practice of ministry, continuing education never became the requirement except by some denominational settings. And even there, it gets lessened and lessened over time. So I think that what I would say is that continuing education has the advantage of being able to take ministry experience and bring it into theological, biblical, emotional, behavioral reflection. And you just don't, Tom Long tells a story about the homiletics professor who had a student who graduated And in his first semester at the church, there was a death, and he called his professor and said, "Coach me. This is my first funeral." And the and the professor said, "Remember, look at this unit in liturgy. We went over what to do, and look at this unit in homiletics. We went over about that." And the recent graduate said, "Yeah, but this guy's dead." There is a sense in which the reality of pastoral practice invites different sets of questions, different interests, different ways of thinking theologically. And it's not till it's not till after the person's been absorbed in those moments that they're able to come back, and continuing education can provide models of working with pastors to help them think and feel in ways that their congregations. It's Aaron. It's about coming in for your question about how do you pastor in a deeply polarized environment, and then having the continuing education event, not one new set of skills for dealing with a deeply polarized environment, but what are you doing as a Christian and as a human being living in the middle of an environment where you can't say anything that isn't going to offend someone, or do what you think is the role of the church in its public witness without potentially offending someone. And then you can talk about the skills stuff, but I bet to the extent continuing education programs have sort of focused on that, it's been what skills do you need to focus in this moment. It's not been this integration of who you are as a Christian human being, who is a leader of this community of faith at this time. I don't know what Daryl would say, Helen, but I don't think that this is that the work you're coordinating for your schools is ancillary to theological education. It may, and I think that over time, and with the growing company of ministers that are going to be out there, it's going to be the primary venue for it. Mm-hmm. That won't sell when you're trying to get a budget increase, I know, but it is the trajectory we're on. And what I think will happen to postgraduate theological education is the increase of baccalaureate level patterns of ministry education, of part-time, of badges. We're not going to have badges, I don't think, but we're going to have the equivalent of kind of focused licensing sorts of education. So the patterns of education you've been overseeing may become the dominant ones in the next 2 decades. I won't be around in 2 decades, very sure. So I'll go ahead and just say that. And
no, thank you. I think yeah. Helen, please.
I was going to invite you, Aaron, to share Doris's question, which is in the chat. And I think this is a great question. I was about to put something in the chat, and I know, Aaron, you're going to need to take off in a few minutes, so the host responsibilities will go over to me. So if you see Aaron disappear,
that's why
it's not the rapture. So one of the reasons I want to sort of point out the importance of Doris's question is, as you're talking about the increased marginalization in a complex transitional culture of theological education, the role of religion and pastoral leadership, those of us who are on screen right now as lifelong learning leaders within these anxious institutions often feel ourselves marginalized in the same sort of way. Vis-a-vis the rest of the theological school denomination, whatever larger organization we find ourselves in. So Aaron, if you could share Doris's question, with a little bit of that framing, knowing what the concerns are of the folks in this room.
Dan, I'm just going to put it, just the final sentence, I think, of Doris's question in the chat, puts it really concisely, and because we've got about 5 minutes left here, I want to give you more chance. How do we convince our faculties or theological education boards to change curriculum to meet the challenges of the day to do this?
The faculty were trained as disciplinarians. They know their disciplines. They know them very well. They know them so well that they can organize ministry around their discipline and do it well. Their students never will. They won't get into a discipline so deeply that it can become the organizing principle for how they lead worship at Mount Pisgah on the hill. And so it's very hard to get faculty to decide to do something differently than they have spent their entire careers doing. And because it's so organizing way of seeing ministry for them, there's not necessarily the perception that their students won't be able to be educated in the same way they have. It took a PhD to get them to their level of disciplinary expertise, plus all of the years of teaching since. So it's very hard. What I would do is encourage a faculty to pay attention to what their favorite or their most esteemed alumni are saying. So that when it comes to curriculum revision, every faculty member is responsible for having a conversation with a graduate that they think is just the best student they ever had. And what is that individual saying about what they need or don't need? The other thing on curriculum revision is we know that there is a certain predictable phenomenon. After people graduate, they want more skills. If you ask them that while they're an MDiv student, they want more New Testament electives. The question of skills doesn't emerge until they're in the problematic of trying to deal with those skills. What I think is to understand maybe how different patterns of education can really enhance the skill development or the relational development or the other kinds of development that I talk about in my definition of formational theological education. I think that they don't want somebody who's going to lead their parents' funeral or baptize their grandchildren who doesn't have a sense of pastoral wholeness. And I would ask sometimes the faculty, who do you want to be the pastor of these people who are dear to you? And what do you want them, how do you want them to be constructing their ministry understanding? And my hunch is that you would get a question, you might get responses one edge beyond disciplinary expertise. I think that I have huge respect for faculty. It's very hard for them to come and create a curriculum that is going to be built around the disciplines by which they have learned to organize their own ministry. And so we've got to come at it from a different perspective, from the perspective of alums, from the perspective of what they hope in pastoral practice, if we're talking about the MDiv curriculum, and what that might mean. Doris, it's nice to see you and to hear from you. I think that one of the things going on is that everybody is feeling a little isolated right now. I think that the biblical people are feeling isolated. I think that the kind that it's so amazing to me that such small schools can erect such tall silos around work, and in fact, so somehow the isolation is something shared. And maybe it's a matter of inviting conversation that moves across parts of the theological school to talk together. I don't know. That sense of isolation culturally and even within small theological schools is a deep reality.
Friends, we are at 1:00. I have a hunch that this conversation could go on a lot longer. I'm deeply appreciative, Dan, of you sharing the wisdom here. I'm remembering conversations you and I have had about how the future of theological education really needs to include the importance of lifelong learning as a significant part of the scope and portfolio. I'm remembering with gratitude and something that I'm going to take with me. I dropped it into the chat from just this conversation, this notion that we're not talking about an anti-intellectual formation of people, but I loved what you said about the intellectual formation being decentered in a way that has it at the service of helping people articulate their effective behavior, spiritual maturation in the vernacular, the language of the tradition. My hunch is that the contribution those of us around the screen can make to this good work is continuing to provide communities of practice for these pastors. They know what to do when that parishioner says, "That was the worst damn sermon I ever heard." Where, you know, they took the homiletics course, they took the scripture course, as you did, I'm sure, at seminary. But what do we do with that information in terms of folding it into the wisdom we have as a leader in that community, rather than just having that as a referendum on our failure and shutting down? This is what lifelong learning opportunities can provide. Any last words, Dan, you want to share with the good folks around the screen before we end our time together?
All the best in your work. It is meaningful and probably is going to grow in meaning over time.
We would like to think so.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Stay tuned. Check your email inboxes soon for our upcoming newsletter, and we'll let you know about our next online webinar. Again, best wishes, everybody. Thank you so much.
Take care.
Thank you, Tom. Good to see you, Daniel.
Yeah.